Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you all here today and thank you so much for coming out, especially in this biblical weather. We really appreciate it. As you can see from the timetable, we have an excellent day ahead of us, but I will just hold us up briefly to do a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, by way of introduction, my name is James. This is Maria, Holly, Shauna, and in the front row we also have Helen and Thomas. We're all master's graduates from the centre who've been working on this project, and we are the organisers of this conference. So on our behalf, once again, thank you so much for coming out today. Emergency exits are to the rear and the front of the auditorium. If you're looking for the bathrooms, as you exit, the ladies are to the right, the gents are to the left. And we would maybe ask that if you haven't already, you would turn your phone on silent, and please keep refreshments outside of the auditorium. You may have noticed our cameras over here. The speakers are being recorded, but the audience is not, so no fears of that. And if you have a question, we are conscious of time, but we do hope to have some Q&As at the end of every segment. And if you're concerned about projection or anything, we do have this handheld mic that you are absolutely free to use. And so without further ado, I'm going to just hand you over to Shauna here, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, James, and thanks very much, everyone, for coming out today. As James said, we really appreciate it. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Siobhan Mullally, and Catherine Connolly, TD for Galway West, is due to join us. She's just a bit delayed, I think, with the weather. So we're conscious of timing, and we're going to kick off with Siobhan. For those of you who don't know Siobhan, she is an established professor of human rights law and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights here in the School of Law in the University of Galway. So we're really so thrilled to have her expertise and her knowledge of human rights law to really kind of ground our discussion today and to open it and give it some context. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Siobhan. Thanks very much, everyone.
So good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and welcome everyone, and a huge congratulations to Mary Harney and to the LLM Human Rights Clinic for the organisation of today's event and for bringing this to fruition. The discussions about today's event have been going on for some time, the planning, the work, all that goes into organising an event like this. And thinking about what to present, what to discuss, and how to move beyond today's work. It didn't just happen, so it's taken a huge amount of work, and I can see many of our PhD students are here as well, many former students, current students, as well as those who were directly involved in the project. So congratulations first and foremost to all of you, in particular, of course, to Mary, and thank you for the opportunity to talk this morning. And I want to, before beginning, and I'm just going to give a few opening remarks, I want to acknowledge the experiences, the lived experiences of many of those who are here today, directly who have experienced Ireland's dark histories of institutional abuse. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the discussions today, and I think it's your experiences, your perspectives, your testimonies that will inform how we think about planning a new curriculum for our schools, for our second level institutions, for our primary schools, for our universities, to really ensure that we're reflecting on the full scope of human rights education, and that we are ensuring that these histories are taught and are based on your testimonies and your stories. The conference has arisen out of a process of education, human rights education, activism, and what we call movement lawyering, which is at the heart of our Human Rights Clinic programme at the Irish Centre for Human Rights. It's grassroots based, it's based on learning from lived experiences, partnerships with community activists, engaging students as active learners, and that's really what has brought today's event to fruition. And that process is absolutely critical and essential to the realisation of rights. Rights holders being involved, directly involved, actively engaged in the process of thinking about how to realize human rights, how to enjoy human rights, how to ensure that the promise of universal enjoyment of human rights is made real, or that we continue to working towards making it real against many, many obstacles. The language of human rights is very powerful. It's particularly powerful to those who are denied the experience of human rights and the enjoyment of human rights. But the process of claiming rights is not an easy one. It's not something that simply happens. It is a process of ongoing work. And it is an important and absolutely essential challenge to the imposition of power and denials of human rights. The claiming of human rights is a way of countering and responding to the silencing of histories, the silencing of abuses of human rights and violations of human rights. So it's that language of human rights that we draw on to counter those silences, to make visible the experiences of human rights, and to pose those as challenges to those in positions of power who deny those experiences or try to limit those experiences or silence the full story in so many different ways. And unfortunately, we see that law can be used and legal tools can be used to claim rights, to challenge power, but can also be used to impose silences and to try to exclude and deny experiences of human rights abuses. So it's a constant struggle, and that's why we talk about movement lawyering, that mobilizing, that engaging, that activism every day is so essential to realize human rights. And we talk about past abuses sometimes, so we talk about histories of abuses, but as we know, the silencing and the failure to realize human rights is in itself a continuing violation of human rights. So it's a continuing violation, in particular in Ireland, of the state's obligation to take positive steps to promote truth and justice. And that is a legal obligation grounded in international human rights law. It's not simply an aspiration or a hope. It is a legal obligation on the state to ensure access to truth, to promote truth and justice as a way of responding to past abuses and responding to continuing violations of human rights. And I just want to mention briefly a process that I was involved with in my capacity as a special rapporteur of the UN on trafficking in persons, especially women and children. That's part of what's known as the UN Special Procedures. I was appointed in August 2020 by the UN Human Rights Council, which is an intergovernmental organisation. But I and other special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council, we operate in an independent capacity. We are independent of states, independent of civil society, and independent of the UN. So we are appointed through an open process, and it's important that that is known and understood, that we operate independently. And in 2021, November 2021, 8 of the UN special procedures, including my mandate as Special Rapporteur in Trafficking in Persons, 8 of us joined together to write to the Irish government, specifically on the question of the failure to investigate the histories of mother and baby homes and related institutions, and the failure to address the state's obligations to enable and facilitate access to truth and effective remedies. This joining together of 8 different special procedures was unprecedented, and it doesn't happen easily or quickly. It takes a lot of time to get 8 of those different mandates to come together, to review the evidence that was submitted, to review the testimonies, to take account of those, and to take a decision to make a public statement to the Irish government, to ask questions, to raise concerns, and to highlight the human rights law obligations that concerns were raised were not being met. And I'll just mention briefly who were these, what were the different human rights concerns, and what were the different mandates. The Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, the Special Rapporteur on the Sale and Sexual Exploitation of Children, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, including its causes and consequences, the Special Rapporteur on Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation and guarantees of non-recurrence, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, and my mandate as Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And I name those because that gives you a sense of the range of human rights abuses and concerns that were brought to the attention of these mandates, the range of evidence and testimonies that were submitted, and the legal concerns raised across those range of issues, from the right to truth and justice, from trafficking in persons, from contemporary forms of slavery, torture, inhuman and degrading treatment. And the response and the letter to the Irish government documented the whole body of international human rights law going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and even before that, older legal instruments, norms and standards of international law that had continuing effect and that were not being addressed in Ireland's responses to those abuses. And while our history books will teach us about Ireland's engagements and do teach us about Ireland's engagement with the United Nations, we have to work together to ensure that these histories and these stories are also being told as part of Ireland's engagement with international law, international human rights law, UN systems, that these concerns have been raised directly with the state and the government, that it is not addressing and investigating those past and ongoing human rights abuses. And since that communication to the Irish government, as you all know, there have been more recent communications again, specifically highlighting the experiences of children and mothers in the mother and baby homes and related institutions, particularly experiences of racism, raised by the Working Group on Persons of African Descent, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, again, responding to the submissions, the testimonies, the concerns being raised, that these human rights violations and abuses were still not being properly investigated and responded to. And an essential part of the response and part of the project that has led to today's event is about how we develop new curriculums, human rights education, curriculum reform, a rewriting of our histories, so that we can ensure that children and schools and teachers are engaging with these accounts of human rights abuses and learning from them how to address them, how to ensure that they don't occur again. Now, we hear much about human rights engagement as being about empowerment. The project that has led to today's event has been led by Mary Harney, a PhD researcher at the Irish Centre for Human Rights and also a graduate of the Master's Programme and of the Human Rights Clinic. And this clinic process has been about claiming human rights. It's been about fighting back against a partial and incomplete and exclusionary version of our history that denies truth and justice and that seeks to limit possibilities for truth. And it does that by imposing so many legal constraints, raising so many legal obstacles to the claiming of that truth. So it's a project that has been about fighting back against the silences imposed by the state, and in particular the gendered attempts by the state to impose closure. We see repeated and we hear repeated references to closure, a very gendered response, as if somehow there is a requirement of closure rather than truth and justice and effective remedies. And it's a way of fighting back against these attempts to deny to survivors the possibility of claiming rights. And through this project of education, we've seen a whole range of tools: podcasting, lesson plans, survivors, speakers, panels. And the Human Rights Clinic itself has been documenting, archiving, and presenting Ireland's human rights histories. The questions asked and the human rights concerns raised include questions about right to life, freedom from torture, slavery, forced labour, unmarked graves, vaccine trials, illegal adoptions, trafficking and sale of children, inhuman and degrading treatment of mothers and families. Mary Harney travelled to the UN Human Rights Committee earlier this year with Kelly Ledoux, another of our graduates, and presented to the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva in relation to Ireland's 5th review under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And her legal analysis, her testimony and advocacy corrected the record that had been presented by the state. It corrected the statement of human rights compliance that had been presented. And her submissions, her report, her analysis of the state's obligations and failures to ensure redress, to investigate and establish the truth of past and ongoing human rights violations was a highlight of that review process. All of those engaging, the committee members, the NGOs, the activists, the human rights defenders, acknowledged and recognised that, but also importantly, recognise that without this testimony, without this work, without this movement lawyering, this rigorous legal analysis, we would have had yet again an incomplete history of our human rights record. And yet again, following on from that testimony, the UN Human Rights Committee, following many other UN human rights treaty bodies, insisted on Ireland's obligation to ensure a thorough investigation of our history of institutional abuse, and particularly criticised the exclusion of human rights and equality principles from the terms of reference of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, and the alleged failure of the Commission to thoroughly and effectively investigate all allegations of abuse. And again, importantly, the UN Human Rights Committee called on Ireland to ensure the full recognition of the violation of human rights of all victims in these institutions, and to establish a transitional justice mechanism to fight impunity and guarantee the right to truth for all victims. So this is what this project has been about. This is what Mary's testimony to the committee and presentations and submissions were about. And Ireland has a very strong record of human rights education, of supporting transitional justice processes in many parts of the world, in South Africa, in East Timor, Sierra Leone, in Colombia. But we need to turn the gaze back. Education about past and ongoing human rights violations is essential to a transitional justice process that is inclusive. Too often we know that human rights law and practice in transitional justice has been and continues to be deeply gendered, denying harms that have been endured in particular by women, by mothers and families. So this work is critically important to ensuring an equal, inclusive, open and just transitional response to those human rights abuses. The advocacy work of Mary Harney and of the LLM Human Rights Clinic, of all of the survivors who've been involved in movements to seek redress and truth, is about turning the gaze back on ourselves. When we teach about human rights law and human rights violations, far too often we're teaching about places very far away or thinking about places far away. So we need to turn the gaze back and teach about our own histories of human rights abuses. And critically, we need to ensure, as this project is doing, that the lived experiences of those who have survived and lived through these abuses and these histories of human rights violations are to the fore. When victims of human rights abuses are situated only as abject victims, human rights are returned to the sender, the humanitarians, the internationals too often. So the movement lawyering process in this project has been critical in changing that way of doing things and thinking about human rights education as about ensuring that the voices of those directly affected are to the fore. In our communication to Ireland from the special procedures of the UN, I just want to highlight in particular the Special Rapporteur on the right to truth, justice and reparation. He highlighted the inalienable right to know the truth about past events concerning the perpetration of heinous crimes and about the circumstances and reasons that led to the perpetration of those crimes, and highlighted that a full and effective exercise of the right to the truth is a vital safeguard against the recurrence of violations. We need to think about this as part of our democratic process. And reparations must aspire, to the extent possible, to subvert instead of reinforcing existing patterns of subordination, gender hierarchies, marginalisation and inequalities. So we need to ensure that our human rights education processes are disruptive, and I think we can rely on Mary and the Human Rights Law Clinic to ensure that this will be disruptive and it will be transformative. Human rights education, if it is to be transformative, must ask the challenging questions, must be disruptive, must be transformative. So look forward to the discussions today and continuing to work on this project to bring these histories into our school curriculums, into our human rights education across all levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for your time and for that opening introduction to today. We'd also like to welcome now Catherine Connolly, who is Independent TD for Galway West and the Las Ceann Comhairle. Catherine has been peerless and fearless in her advocacy in the Dáil and outside the Dáil for survivors and those with lived experience. None more so than this week when she was challenging the mother and baby redress scheme in the Dáil, and we're delighted that she has extended her working week into Saturday to be with us today, and it's our privilege to have you here, so thank you so much, Catherine.
Díomh cóide agus I gcónaí a reis an ollscoil seo maithíon beag í nar bhíseach mar cuimhníam ar maléhantáin seo agus na scrúdia agus nach rá mo ggóchan oibre déanta don na scrúdia so maithom má tá mé beag an nar bhíseach ach gur míle mágad a Mary Harney a socht an cuara ach ní rá mé rosásta í nó riire for dúirt me oh God ach tá sé Harbh tábhacht go bhfuil mé an seo agus cúpla focail rá. Friends, when I'm back in the college, I always feel a little nervous because immediately the exam days come back to me. And I was one of those students that hid at the back until I went to England to do clinical psychology, and suddenly I was seen. And I can tell you that was an absolute awakening for me. So thank you to Mary Harney for persuading me to be here today, because often I think, God, I can't keep talking about this. And I'm boring myself. I use that word advisedly now, boring. And I think, no, then something happens like this week and we see a scheme that's anything but just, fair or based on human rights. And I think I and the other like-minded TDs in the Dáil have to speak out, whether we like it or not. And so thank you for that opportunity. And so Siobhan talked about the powerful language of human rights. Absolutely, the powerful language, even more powerful would be to enforce those human rights, and we haven't done that. And so today is the start of a conversation in relation to the teaching of the history of the institutions, or as Professor Smith refers to them, the architecture of containment. And it's extremely important that we do that. And I'm no expert on lesson plans. Fiona, I see friends there, and Peter, but I'm thinking it should be taught at university, which you're doing, certainly should be taught to us politicians and to civil servants. Maybe that's where we should start, but maybe that's not such a hopeful passage. I want to thank, there are two books that I was forced to read and had the privilege of launching, and Ireland and the Magdalene Laundries Campaign for Justice with Catherine O'Donnell, Ed McKettrick, Maeve O'Rourke and Professor Smith. And it was in Mary Steed. And it was instrumental in giving me the language and the framework of transformative justice that I didn't have. But it helped to back up my own reading and my own gut instinct, which was very important. And similarly, the other book, Legacies of the Magdalene Laundry, and again, a number of editors, Miriam Houghton, Mary McAuliffe, and Emily Pine. And looking at different ways of looking at this story. And it's some story, really, isn't it, that hasn't been told. And of course, this report, and for your information, I've 30 copies in my office if anybody would like to take a box home. And this is volume 1. And there are 6 volumes. And because I insisted that we have copies, I got special delivery 30 copies, and now I have storage problems. So if any of you would like to take them. But this was to tell the story, wasn't it? With the 3 wise people in charge, the 3 academics. They were to listen and to tell us the story. And you know, they did tell us the story really, because it's there in the various volumes. But the difficulty is when they drew their conclusions, they were way off the mark. And the conclusions and not the recommendations, but the conclusions and the recommendations, which were all mixed up, bore no resemblance or no connection with the stories told by the women. And so I'm struck by today that we talked about absence and presence. Well, there was an absence of women's voices, and the courageous 550 people did come forward to tell their story, but they weren't heard. And not alone were they not heard, but a little warning and a caveat was put in that lovely report of 6 volumes, that a warning that their evidence was contaminated, as opposed to the witnesses who went to the commission. So these lovely... I find it difficult not to be sarcastic, because I've taken the trouble of reading the whole book, and it just seems, you know, it's nauseating, I use that word in the Dáil, to look at the conclusions and try and match them. And so they put in a caveat that the evidence of the 550 people was contaminated. Why? Now, first of all, in my previous life, I heard the word contamination in relation to exhibits. Exhibits in court cases might have been contaminated, or in criminal law cases, and you had to be very careful. I never heard of the word evidence being contaminated. I heard of it being credible or not credible. So really what they were saying when this evidence was contaminated, that it wasn't credible. The evidence wasn't credible. And they said it out in clear black and white. And then they also told us on a page that it wasn't in accordance with the prevailing narrative. These 3 wise people told us, but they didn't tell us what the prevailing narrative was. But they told us that we would be disappointed because they had the courage to go against the prevailing narrative. The prevailing narrative to me was that women were silenced, they were incarcerated, that the religious orders had nothing to do with that. And then this book comes forward, and does something similar all over again. Presence and absence. I'm struck over and over by our failure to learn as a country, our absolute failure to learn. And so we had the Rhine report, and we had a waiver there which was appalling, and I was part of that in a former life, where it was an offence and remains an offence for me to disclose anything about my clients in terms of what they got or didn't get. And we're persisting with that waiver in this new scheme without any basis, because it seems to me very few people would have the energy to go forward to the courts after they go to this scheme, because you're burnt. You're sorely worn out and burnt. But we continue with that waiver. We also continue with exclusion and discrimination. So anybody under 6 months in any of these mother and baby homes are excluded. Somebody might just tell me, 22 maybe? Yeah. Excluded from the scene. And so I think next week I'm going to get another chance in relation to this topic. And it seems to me that the most important thing I could say is that as a mother or a father, we can forget about nurturing our babies up to 6 months, because it doesn't make a difference. We don't need to worry about them at all, because the civil servants and the minister now tells us that the first 6 months of life don't matter at all. So we can relax. All those nights up and breastfeeding, all utterly not important, because bonding is not important. It's significant that we're in the biology building today and we're being told not important at all, that biological bonding and that psychological bonding, absolutely not important. And then what is the scheme about, to me, that they're bringing in? It's certainly not based on human rights. It's based on, as I said in the Dáil, a cold, calculated system of exclusion, to leave out the thousands that were under 6 months, to leave out the thousands that were boarded out. And we are talking thousands here, but we're still talking about a finite number. And we set up a consultation process to learn from Cara Nua, and I see Fiona there. And I always talk about Cara Nua, a new friend, which was really the old enemy in disguise. And we misuse Irish language all of the time. because Cara knew it was absolutely dreadful and subjected those that went forward to further abuse. But we were to learn from that. We were also to learn from the Magdalene Laundry debacle, which the Ombudsman described as maladministered. And we failed to learn from that, and we've come forward with this scheme. There's so much. I would appeal to you today, if you do nothing else, make a commitment to actually get this. Take them out of my office if you can. But do read it, because it's very important in terms of human rights that people come forward and tell their story, and then we utterly disregard what they say. We trample on their human rights. And we tell them we know best, and we twist language on its head. And I think actually in my experience in the Dáil since 16, and indeed on the City Council beforehand, that's the most upsetting thing that I find, the misuse of language. It's sort of parallel universes all of the time. What's been said is not what's been done at all, over and over and over again. And I want to thank, honestly, the Human Rights and the Human Rights Clinic, the books that I've mentioned, because the survivors on the ground, and I'm never comfortable with the word survivors, but I take my lead from ye in relation to it. I know the mother and baby home in Tuam on a personal and professional basis. I was there when Minister Sapone and Minister Coveney talked about closure, when the debate when they had barely begun to recognise, talked about closure, you remember that, stood up and said, we want to bring closure. So it's year work, and year work that has stopped that closure. So please don't ever think that you're not having an effect on me or my colleagues in the Dáil who are also standing up and talking. You are. And this collaboration and this conversation is really vital. It makes us constantly reflect. You talk about reflection and a prism and looking through a lens. Without your help, without your courage and your academic work, without your experience, the narrative in the Dáil would continue and has continued, in fact, as the report told us. It was society, the mothers, no compulsion. They walked right in there, didn't they? They just walked in and they gave up their baby. And of course we know now why, because it didn't really matter. Bonding meant nothing. No value on bonding whatsoever. I could go on, I won't. The architecture of containment and the amount of people who went through our institutions, I don't know how we can come ever to terms with that without honesty and without proper education for all of us. I brought in this book because it encaptures for me A Woman to Blame, which was the story of the Kerry Babies case. Also worth looking at, really, a gem of a book by Nell McCafferty. But the reason I bring it in is because it's all contained there. That's it, A Woman to Blame. Women to blame, society to blame. The exact same theme over and over. You'd imagine we'd have learned from this in the 80s. We didn't. In fact, there wasn't a single female voice in this, not a single female judge, one judge, barristers all, solicitors all male, every one of them. And it was to be the guards that were to be the subject of the investigation, but it became the woman and her background and her sexuality. And we still didn't rise up. That was the year my first son was born. So we all have a duty here to read and to learn. You won't get that from debates in the Dáil, but you'll get it from today, which is the start of a conversation, and you'll get it from the books and the report. So gar míle mágah agus go nairi liv module wur which ibra aniu agus tá súlagam go mainwich but by fuinne vagan lenach the rai agus kesten a car agus súl a quinál cursi cuachta igoni that we speak truth to power always, no matter what institution we're in, whether it's the institution of the Dáil, this university, which needs to constantly reflect on what it's about in terms of education, and all other institutions. Without that self-reflection and constant questioning, we're in serious trouble as a democracy. Gar míle mágah.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that. We're now welcoming Philomena Mullen on stage. Philomena is Assistant Professor of Black Studies in the Department of Sociology at Trinity College, Dublin. So today she'll be talking about the exclusion of the mixed-race child from the narrative of institutions. Thank you so much. Philomena.
Morning, everybody. And I want to start by thanking Mary for inviting me to take part today. And also there's a thank you from Conrad, who is also a member of the Association of Mixed Race Irish. Can you hear me? Where's the... Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me say thank you, Mary? Thank you, Mary. I was at a talk the other day with one family, and Mary Robinson and Mary Henry were there, and there were other Marys there, and I disclosed that my first name is Mary, so I'm beginning to think there's something in the name Mary for Irish women and for activism. So my talk today is about what we describe as epistemic injustice, okay? It's about the wrong that's been done to hundreds of mixed-race Irish children who grew up in the institutions. And this wrong has been done by excluding them from the narrative of the institutions. And it's what I've called, it's a term called presence of absence, okay? It's this sense that you're there, but you don't count, okay? So absence of presence means you're not there, but presence of absence means you're there, but you're not visible, and you don't come up in the records anywhere. So it's a term that was used or developed by Rousseau, an academic called Rousseau. And so we as mixed race children haven't really come up in the records or in a lot of the research that's been done in terms of who were the children who were in the institutions. And I suppose in a way we make up a subset of the children that actually were put into institutions. So I've just done a slideshow for you today. So the children that I'm talking about were almost invariably the children of Black African fathers and white Irish mothers. And these children came in large part from the arrival of students and professionals such as doctors and engineers from several African states to work and study in Irish institutions, all the way back to, I'm saying the 1940s, but I also know that there were African students here as far back as the 1920s. And so another source of these children were also children who were born to Irish women who emigrated to the UK, who had relationships with Black and African men in the UK, and then on many occasions brought their children back to Ireland and placed them in care. And one of the interesting things about my research that I've done is that many of these children who were born to women who came from the UK, a lot of these women tried to keep their children, even though they were coloured. And I have research where the children were not actually put into care till they were around 11 months old, 9 months old. So women, Irish women, did try to keep their children, even if they were going to be stigmatised by this. And obviously there were, of course, women who did keep their children, and I'm sure it was under very difficult circumstances. So in the 90s, when the Irish state felt obliged to set up a number of commissions into abuse within the network of state-sponsored and Catholic Church-administered institutions, which, again, we've already described as the architecture of containment, or a carceral archipelago, as Kate Gleason called them, race was never included in any of the terms of reference. And even within what Maureen Gaffney calls the attempts of secrecy and concealment, this failure to address race ignored and concealed a great secret about the institutions and about Irish history. And Irish society of the early 1920s up to the 80s. And that's the presence of hundreds of mixed-race Irish children that were in the institutions and who were born to Irish mothers. And it's interesting to note that the category of Black African or Caribbean mother Irish father, or white mother Irish father, is always almost invariably the only category that we have. So we didn't find any Black mothers Irish fathers within the categories for research. And I haven't come across anybody else who's come across that category. So it's almost always been Black fathers, Irish mothers. So the failure to include race is evident, even right up to the last report, where we actually had to demand recognition and to demand that would be included and that race be included in the mother and baby homes and certain related matters investigation, which was established in 2015. So mixed race survivors were again either being ignored or considered aberrations. And race, again, like I say, was initially excluded as a theme from this terms of reference as well. So echoing Gaffney's phrase from an earlier slide, we could probably just say that the stench of shame that she talks about that was associated with the institutions also had a colour as well. And what I mean by that is that there were many children of African Irish descent incarcerated throughout the state, and many of their stories were harrowing, such as that you can see on screen, the story by Kaylin Hogan in her Republic of Shame. And it's a book that I'd strongly recommend you to read. And there are stories like this sprinkled throughout my research. So there was this notion of special attention being paid to the mixed race child, or the coloured child as we were known as. And you can see on the slide that it's claimed by a Department of Education Inspector, Dr. Lysett, in his report, that it was quite apparent the nuns give special attention to these unfortunate children who are frequently found hot-tempered and difficult to control. And this was trenchantly picked apart by commentators like Mary Raftery and Owen O'Sullivan, who stressed not only were these remarks racist, but they were also inaccurate. And many of these so-called coloured children testify that they received no such special attention. And they say that they received the same beatings and abuse as most of the other children within the system. And the Association of Mixed Race Irish would go further than this, based on research amongst mixed race survivors. And also, we would say that augmented by the testimony of other survivors, we'd argue that on occasion abuse was actually exacerbated by racialization processes within the institutions. So in response to this government's neglect and conscious of the abuse that mixed race children had endured in the institutions, in 2013 to 2014, the Association of Mixed Race Irish, or as AMRI as it's known, was founded as a campaign and support group to work to highlight the overt policy of racial discrimination in this historic care system in Ireland. And the group prepared research on our own mixed race community and the impact of racism that was experienced by mixed race children in institutional settings. And AMRI actively lobbied the Irish government to investigate the treatment of mixed race children in mother and baby homes, and aligned our voices with representatives of the Irish traveller community and disability advocates to ensure that discrimination was included in the terms of reference for the Commission. So directly as a result of this activism, the Commission was tasked with investigating specific matters in relation to the mother and baby homes in Article 1, including religion, race, traveller identity, or disability. And in December 2019, AMRI brought their case to the UN Office of the Human Rights in Geneva and submitted a shadow report to the UN Committee on the elimination of racial discrimination in that session in Geneva. And the result of this was that CERD made a clear statement and concluding observation on the actions of the Irish state, and that they should meet the convention in relation to mixed race people in Irish institutions. And importantly, for the first time, a UN body had specifically named mixed race Irish as an ethnic group who needed protection under the convention. So before returning to the report's findings on black children within the institutions, I draw your attention to the statement from one expert witness, Brian Fanning. Oh, sorry, I think I cut him out to shorten the presentation. But Brian Fanning did talk about how mixed-race children, again, were stigmatised and racialised within the institutions, and that the government's statements that this isn't true are contrary to the evidence that has been given by mixed-race children on their own experiences. So these racialised processes are immediately evident in a leaked collaborative report that came out in 2020, in February 2020, which made for really shocking reading as it detailed racist abuse, racial profiling, apartheid-like segregation in mother and baby homes, and also in industrial schools as well, towards mixed-race Irish children. And the report found that skin colour was often listed as a defect in files and that they were considered unsuitable for adoption. And furthermore, the broadcast media reported that children were, and I quote, eugenically rated based on a nun's assessment of, quote, the intelligence of the natural mother and how negroid the features of the infant were. So skin colour then became the markers of diminished humanity and intellectual and cultural inferiority. And another story reported that in St. Patrick's Mother and Baby Home in Dublin, there was a room they called the reject ward, where they put mixed race and disabled babies. And it was reported by one person, or quoting one person, they were treated like animals. One witness reported that one nun used to drag them around like rag dolls, and I knew something was going to happen to them. Every time I went into the nursery, there was another cot empty. And another witness stated that she saw them being given injections. This is my file here I should show you, just to refer to it there. Where am I? Over here, you can just see coloured scrolled across. Yeah. That is my admission form into the institution, and I have illegitimate and coloured added to racialise, profile me racially and as an illegitimate child. So Amory didn't accept the historical context argument that was put forward by the government from the Mother and Baby Home report. And they didn't accept that racism and racial prejudice by staff and inspectors in such positions of power and authority when caring for children should be explained away by historical context. And nor was there any excuse for staff not understanding ethnicity and culture at that time when they could and should have been trained. Let me see, my slides have gone a little out of kilter. So just move to this. You can see from a thorough reading of the report that it highlights the contradictory nature of the findings on race as reported by the Commission. So, for example, decisions made with respect to placing these children took account of their race, and the Commission notes with concern that the number of mixed-race children born to unmarried mothers, while smaller than the number with a disability, reflects a racial reality of Ireland of this period. And this tallies with both my own experience of growing up in an industrial school as well as my research, which highlighted significant clusters of children of Black and African Irish descent, usually in isolated, non-city or town institutions. And this was confirmed in the Ryan report that cites a 1970s report by the childcare advisor in the Department of Education, Graham Granville. And Granville stated in his annual report that it would appear upon examination of the files that in the past many of the children admitted to Clifton were received into care to be removed out of sight, out of mind. And this policy, in his opinion, was applied especially to children of different racial backgrounds. And I should say that I was born actually in Holles Street, but was sent down to Loughrea. So it does seem to tally with that notion of being sent away to isolated areas. One of the characteristically problematic aspects of these children of Black and African Irish descent also was this difficulty in placing them for adoption. And witnesses pointed out that mixed-race children often had to be moved from institution to institution before they got a home. And another added that coloured babies will be here for a long time as nobody wants them, which appears to be untrue in some of the testimony that has come from mixed-race children who did have families who wanted to adopt them. But the families were told that the birth mother, a natural mother, refused to sign the papers. And it was only in later years when the women and survivors got their files that they discovered the mothers had actually signed the papers for them to be adopted if anybody wanted to take them. But for some reason or other, they were never put forward. So the Mother and Baby Home Report is littered with examples of the difficulties faced by children of Black and African Irish descent from a multitude of witnesses and sources, including organisations dealing with adoption or fostering, and national newspapers which highlight the difficulties with getting children adopted, as well as the lack of positive expectation and the future outcome for these children. And we can see these are all a lot of quotes taken from the different reports. And it's interesting how contradictory the report is, in its statements. For me, this was probably one of the most harrowing stories that I came across. This is the story of Mary Josephine Stevenson. She was a 6-year-old who was beaten to death by her foster father. And Mary Josephine, there was a court case after us, and the defence barrister referred to Mary Josephine as a waif and a stray, and a coloured one at that. So this seems to imply that we did have a sense of race and racialisation and the value of race. So there seems to have been a calculation or a calculus of value or devalue that was put on to the death of Mary Josephine. So perhaps the greatest failing of the Commission is that it's a prime example of testimonial injustice, as it failed dismally to address the witness testimonies. So people reported to the Commission, but the stories were not reported by the Commission. And the treatment of children of Black and African Irish descent in the mother and baby homes shouldn't be seen as part of a hierarchy of abuse, but that this group suffered more than another, but as a separate and discrete component of the abusive regime that existed. While disaggregating the racialized stigma and abuse of mixed-race children from the mainstream, mundane abuse within the institutions has finally recognized that not only did this group exist within Ireland's architecture of containment, but they made up significant numbers within that system. And the report is therefore a first official step towards redressing the almost total exclusion of this racialized group. So it's possible to draw direct parallels between the treatment of Black children in the institutions in the 20th century and the treatment of Black children in direct provision in 2022. And I'm minded of the comments by Leo Varadkar while Taoiseach, who stated in the Dáil that direct provision was better than, I quote, camps and containers. And in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, that is, and I quote, is not the same thing as a man being murdered. So this was the Taoiseach's analysis of the situation, okay? So not being murdered is such a low bar to raise or to lower. And whether it's for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in George Floyd's case, or 10 years for a fellow human being stuck floundering in the morass that is the international protection system, In the end, it may just be a degree of rather than kind. A slow death is a slow death in anyone's language. And the number of suicides and deaths, as well as voluntary returns in dangerous circumstances that have occurred as a result of our international protection system and the direct provision accommodation, leads to the same final result. So I'm conscious that kind of similarly plain-speaking defense of the industrial school regime has been offered since the 1990s. And I'm thinking in particular of various articles by David Quinn, who still speaks of alleged abuse in industrial schools. So teachers are positioned to play a significant role in helping students and the public come to terms with the history of the institutions and how their impact still shapes our present. History of the institutions should become embedded, or an embedded aspect of Irish public education. Recent government policies and discourse have moved Ireland towards perhaps framing itself as a nation undergoing transitional justice on behalf of survivors of the homes. And government actions such as official apologies, redress for some, and commemorative efforts might suggest that this is the case. However, the government avoids and silences conversations about greater structural change. And we have there are two academics, Zemblias and Beckerman, and they discuss the notion of what they call a pedagogy of dangerous memories. And they argued that the challenge is whether educators can use past historical traumas to re-socialize children in a manner that's not locked into predefined scripts and collective memories. And they believe that this exposure to testimony of historical trauma in an effective pedagogical manner, that this exposure to testimony of historical trauma as an effective pedagogical move is positioned as helping students work through what has actually been termed difficult knowledge. So in this manner, the true story of the mixed-race child in the institutions and the Irish lack of this historical knowledge, what Sexus calls the ethical dimension of history, can and should be addressed and perhaps rectified through a new school curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for being with us today and for those really, really incredible insights. We really appreciate your time and your input to this debate. It's really valued contributions, so thank you so much. We're delighted as well now to have Noelle Brown join us. Noelle is a playwright, activist and director, and she's going to kind of discuss her perspectives around education through kind of theatre and the dramatic perspective of bringing historical abuses to light and to continue to shed light on them. So thank you, Noelle.
Good morning. I always find these kind of nerve-wracking, even though I'm a performer, because usually you guys would be in darkness and I'd be lit and I wouldn't see any of you. So just bear with me. Just to say thank you to Mary for today and to the graduates as well for this start of these important conversations. In 2013, after being an actor for many years, I co-wrote with my friend Michelle Forbes a play called Postscript. Initially, we went into a room to start the devising process with a completely different idea in mind. But the story of my search for birth information, access to my birth certificate and family medical history kept coming up. At the time in contemporary theatre, artists were sharing and performing a lot of their own personal stories in theatre plays. I was adamant I didn't want to do that. I had spent my entire career saying other people's words, deep in characters I'd fleshed out as an actor from those words, and all the while wearing fabulous costumes, sometimes. After a lot of persuading by Michelle and our collaborator Louisa Carroll, I eventually agreed, as an exercise, to write one letter to my birth mother, who I'd never got to meet. And then I wrote another letter, and another letter. And what I wrote became the spine of the play, and we wrote from there, over the space of a few months, with a view to presenting the show for the first time at the Dublin Fringe Festival as a two-hander to be performed by myself and Bríd Nachtan. It was, professionally, the most terrifying theatre experience I'd ever had. Having co-written the play, performing in, and also co-producing it, I was also standing in front of audiences as myself, using my own name and telling a deeply personal story, that of my lived experience of being an adoptee and trying to trace my birth mother and the details of my birth. There was nowhere to hide. Thankfully, years of being an actor kicked in, and I managed to remember all my lines and not bump into the furniture. After the first outing in the Fringe Festival, I realised we had something more than simply a play, more than just a source of work for us as artists. Because after the performances, many members of the audiences waited to talk to me afterwards. The people who came to see it were survivors of mother and baby homes, adoptees, birth mothers, family and relatives of the 9,000 children who died at the hands of the state in institutions across Ireland. Children who were dumped in mass graves in places like Tuam and Besborough, where I was born, to name but a few. For the rest of the audiences, it was a story that they didn't know anything about in great detail, but wanted to. Friends of mine were shocked to learn that I had no access to my birth certificate, no right to know who I was born to, or even where I was born. I realised for the first time the power of personal testimony and the power of theatre and the platform I had as an artist. Postscript, over the space of almost 10 years, toured Ireland and played in London and Paris. After each performance, we had a post-show discussion, and on 2 occasions, when one wasn't programmed by the venue, the audiences insisted on one. At those post-shows, hundreds of people shared their own personal stories about being survivors of these institutions. It was, as one woman said, because you had just shared yours, standing in front of us, I felt I could tell my story. During one post-show, facilitated by Susan Lohan of the Adoption Rights Alliance, a woman shared her story for the very first time, one she'd kept silent about for 34 years. That woman was Magella Moynihan, who went on to write a book about her experiences of becoming pregnant when she was a member of An Garda Síochána, and the forced adoption of her son, and the end of her career as a Garda because of becoming pregnant while unmarried. Because of the audience reaction, and in particular those post-shows, as well as the hundreds of emails, letters, and social media messages I received, I knew that Postscript was also a piece of activism and was affecting change in a small way by helping to open up the conversation around the right to identity for adoptees and the history of what happened to the incarcerated women and their babies in Ireland's mother and baby homes. I realised that I could, as an artist, help facilitate conversations around this issue and other issues. I wrote 2 plays shortly after Postscript. Foxy, which looked at discrimination towards the travelling community against the backdrop of exploring the red-headed gene, and Creaking, a play about society's treatment of older people. I co-created an event at the Sugar Club around menopause that combined a theatre performance and panel discussions. The theatre text I had written around the menopause event went on to form part of a stand-up comedy set that I still perform regularly. I was writing and performing about issues I cared about that weren't being talked about enough, and it marked a fundamental change for me as an artist. In 2017, during a performance of Postscript in the Peacock at the Abbey Theatre, I noticed a young boy in the second row crying. The next day, he sent me a message on Twitter that said, "Thank you for allowing me to see that other adopted people feel what I feel and have the same questions that I have." The boy was called Ross, and he was then 16, and had been adopted into Ireland at a young age from Russia. I became friends with him and his mum,
And because he was passionate about theatre and wanted to write a play about his experiences of being adopted, I mentored him over a period of a year and a half to write his own play titled It's the Not Knowing That Hurts, which he presented as a rehearsed reading at the Mill Theatre Dundrum with support from Create and the Abbey Theatre. During the mentoring process, we gathered a community of inter-countries adoptees who had never met each other to take part in drama workshops. They all said that it was so great to be around other adoptees who knew how they felt. During the run of the show at the Peacock, I also met for the first time many young people whose parents had been born in mother and baby homes, a new generation of what I hoped would be activists around the issue. They were angry and upset by what had happened to their parents and waited around after the show to talk or sometimes just for a hug. In 2018, I was contacted by the Cork Institute of Technology, who were running a series of events to highlight issues like mother and baby homes. They asked for a performance of Postscript, but unfortunately it wasn't possible to remount the show for one performance. Instead, I offered to perform sections of the play, which I had done once before for a Bernardo's post-adoption service event. The audience on the night was comprised of students who were studying to be social workers. Presumably some of them would end up working in TUSLA or the Adoption Authority of Ireland, I thought. They were an amazing audience, and at a post-show talk afterwards, it was clear that they knew little or nothing about mother and baby homes and the adoptees' lack of rights. They were not long out of school, obviously, and the history of those institutions had not been part of the curriculum, but they were very keen to know as much as possible. Postscript, written in 2013, has been performed on and off over the last almost 10 years. The saddest thing is that the play is still relevant. Nothing has changed since it was written. Adoptees are still fighting for justice, still fighting for the right to their identities, despite the continuous media spin from the Minister for Children and the government that says otherwise. And the signing into law of bills like the deeply discriminatory Information and Tracing Bill are distressing. With this bill, we are still begging for scraps of information from the same state agencies that have treated survivors appallingly for years, who have broken EU law by their misuse of GDPR and blanket redaction of information that is our basic human right. They delay, deny till we die. A reductive redress bill that does not reflect what survivors asked for or what they actually need is being pushed through currently. We need to keep talking about this issue, pushing for change, and more importantly, educate our young people around what happened in institutions like mother and baby homes, the scale of what happened, and the ongoing legacy that people who gave birth to or were born to women in mother and baby homes. We cannot continue to sweep it under the proverbial expensive state carpet at the behest of the Catholic Church, pretend like it didn't happen, isn't still happening. Postscript, unfortunately, does not represent a telling of a period in Irish history that is long past, a dark memory or stain in our history. As survivors, we are still in it. After the publication of the deeply offensive Commission of Investigation report into mother and baby homes in January 2021, the co-directors of the Abbey Theatre contacted me and asked me to be lead artist and curator on a creative response to the disrespectful handling of survivors' testimonies by the Commission. They wanted to give the stage of our national theatre to the voices of survivors, to give them a platform for their testimonies that had been taken from them by the Commission, to reclaim their written words without alteration. I worked with a panel of 6 people who were Katrina Crowe, Michelle Forbes, Jodie O'Neill, Colin Murphy, Conal O'Fahartha and Caroline Williams, and the brilliant staff at the Abbey Theatre. We researched documents and published testimonies from the Clon Project and asked survivors to write their testimonies in their own words and assure them they would not be altered, cut and pasted badly, or taken out of context, as was the case with the Commission. The testimonies and document extracts were read by survivors, actors, campaigners, and public figures and filmed on the Abbey stage. Home Part 1 was presented online on St. Patrick's Day 2021. It was a significant event in the history of Irish theatre and in the history of this country, and survivors felt heard. Around that time, after an interview I did on the Late Late Show, I was contacted by a 13-year-old boy named Owen and his mum. Owen had seen the interview on the Late Late. He'd been asked to do a history assignment in school, and he told me, "I don't want to write about the 1916 Rising again. I want to write about what happened to you as an adoptee." He interviewed me over Zoom and asked brilliantly insightful questions. I spoke to his mum, who was the head of a school, and for the first time I fully realised that the history of what happened in those institutions was not being taught in schools. Apparently the powers that be thought it would be too upsetting for the children and were actively preventing any of that history becoming part of the curriculum. Upsetting. Having to learn about the famine and the Holocaust was upsetting when I was growing up, but it would have been a very strange omission in the history curriculum, and was an important, crucial learning for me as a teenager heading into adulthood. Phil Kingston, head of the Community and Education Department at the Abbey Theatre, began to put together a condensed version of Home Part 1 for schools shortly after its broadcast. There was a very enthusiastic response from teachers, and he hoped it would be a nudge to the Department of Education to put the topic on the curriculum. The first pilot school was Larkin Community in Dublin, and I did a Zoom with the class in question, who were really engaged and asked well thought out questions. The work, which is ongoing, is to take what the Community and Education Department learned from Larkin Community School, make that available to other schools they've worked with before, with a view to making the package available nationwide. I recently finished performing in a new play by Dylan Coburn-Gray called Absent the Wrong as part of the Dublin Fringe Festival. Over the space of 2 years, Dylan collaborated with myself and other cast members and talked to survivors during the writing of the play. He wanted to create an authentic and accurate response to the publication of the Mother and Baby Homes report. As it says in the blurb or the description of the play, "I want to capture the hurt, the anger, the struggle for straight answers. It is an artistic meditation on memory, on archives, on history, on what the official record doesn't show, has never shown, can't show. It's about gaps, generational and informational. How natural it is to want to bridge them, how hard it is to do." It played to packed houses, the large majority of which were younger people, who had little or no knowledge of the scale of the issues and details of what happened to survivors in this country, and the continuing impact of an inaccurate retelling of our history in the Commission's report. As my character in the play, Nancy, who is a survivor, says, in response to the report, "Their words about our words are all that's left after all that heartache." One outcome during the run of the show was that we got word that the Adoption Authority of Ireland, who had been less attentive to survivors in the past, to say the least, sent their staff members to see the play as part of their training. The cast of Absent the Wrong, who were the most incredible ensemble I've ever worked with, and who virtually were all nearly young enough for me to be their mother, were deeply moved when they heard that. They said, "We never thought that could be an outcome of what we were doing." The power of theatre as a platform contributing to change was really clear for us all as a cast. The best compliment I received on my performance during the run of Absent the Wrong was, "I didn't pity your character. I was angry for her." Pity doesn't create change. Anger does. Theatre, through writing and performing, has given me a channel for the anger, the hurt, and sometimes the despair of being a survivor, of being an adoptee, fighting for my rights. It has turned my anger into action. But it's hard emotionally when you blur the lines between the personal and the professional, as a writer and as a performer, when you draw on personal experience, particularly when the fight for justice is far from over. I have a powerful resource as an artist to write, produce, and perform work that reflects issues in our society now. I thought I would have stopped writing and making work about adoptee rights after Postscript, but I found that I have to keep returning to it, and I've written 2 other plays around the subject since then, one titled This Dirty Little Heart, and Spit, which was a commission from a company called Here for Now in Ontario, Canada. They asked me to write a play about adoption and the legacy of mother and baby homes in Ireland. I feel it is my responsibility as an artist and as an adoptee to contribute to effecting change in whatever small way I can. Theatre is how I do it, because theatre is mainly where I've worked for 37 years. My next project, funded by the Arts Council of Ireland, is to research a theatre piece that examines the architecture of incarceration, looking at the buildings that housed mother and baby homes, to explore a visual and sound-based response to buildings that were given the name homes, but were, as we know, actual prisons. I'm sick to death of how this country treats survivors of institutions. And by not having the history of these institutions taught in our schools feels similar to the obliteration of the details of survivors' births. The pressure to leave that alone now and move on. Start your life from the day you were adopted and forget about the dark stuff. How can you teach the history of a country if you leave significant gaps in that history? Gaps dictated by the Catholic Church. Have we learned nothing? It shouldn't be up to the artist to teach young people about the entire history of Ireland's institutions, but instead the arts should build on what they've learned already, to show that living history, or for our work to form part of the curriculum through play texts, books and testimonies, and to support that education. I am a survivor, an adoptee, and a proud bastard, and I reject the legacy of loss and shame that was forced on me. It does not belong to me. I'm an artist who will continue to write and perform around these issues to help highlight our dark history, and I will advocate and fight for this history to be included in the curriculum in any way I can. Because as the quote says, to be forgotten is to die twice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noelle, for that unique and quite moving perspective. We really appreciate you sharing with us. Next, we're going to hear about perspectives and model lesson plans. So you're going to hear a bit from some of us master's graduates, Holly, Helena and Thomas. And we're also going to hear from Dr. Jennifer O'Mahony, who is a lecturer in social, abnormal and forensic psychology in the Waterford Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on victimology and trauma and how those are remembered and narrated by survivors and collectively by society. And she's currently the principal investigator of the Waterford Memories Project. So welcome, guys.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay if I stand? Okay, I'll try and not move for the sound. I'm really taken by Noelle's presentation there and really my interest in examining the history of institutions in Waterford was always about allyship. And while I'm not a direct survivor of the institutions, my life has been directly impacted by the institutions, by the experiences of those very close to me. And I was really taken by the idea of how, as an academic and a lecturer in psychology, as well as somebody who lived in Waterford, where there was a large campus that housed an industrial school and a Magdalen laundry that was really not part of the kind of conscious memory, or at least the spoken conscious memory of the people that were around me. And an active allyship from academia was a difficult sort of terrain to negotiate. And I certainly take the point of anger that's been raised quite a bit, that I had a very angry response to the fact that the buildings that I was working in weren't recognised, weren't being portrayed, weren't being responded to, and reflecting on the history that had occurred within them. And to give you an idea of what the campus looks like, this is the College Street campus of now the Southeast Technological University. So it's the buildings at the sort of the bottom half of the screen here. So you can see the campus is quite extensive, and it housed an industrial school, which is the white building sort of in the top right of the campus, a convent for the religious order and the nuns that were housed on site, a chapel, an industrial school, and a Magdalen laundry. So there was also a bakery on site where the hosts for communion bread were baked, where some of the women and girls worked. But the building, the idea that Noelle had introduced there of the building speaking and representing some of its history, the chapel in the center of the image, which the industrial school was on one side and the Magdalen Laundry on the other, was built by the architect with a design to be inclusive. And we know through historical records that this was the manifestation of the building was meant to be welcoming, it was meant to bring in members of the public and so on. What actually happened was the chapel is in 3 sections, and the nuns, when they took over, walled up the sections so that the industrial school girls would come in on the right side and they wouldn't be able to see or interact with the Magdalen girls that were coming in on the left side. And there were pathways that didn't allow the girls to cross. So the convent was the only part of the building where crossover could potentially happen, but of course girls weren't permitted in that building unless they were cleaning or brought there for something to do with the order of the nuns. So the design of the building was manipulated to reflect the mentality of the people that were existing in that building, or certainly the people that were running the building. So when this campus was bought by the Waterford Institute of Technology, the part of the image in the bottom left with the pointed roofs, that was the actual site of the physical laundry itself. And to the right was where the girls would have lived and slept, and the women as well. So that's the part of the building where the inside was demolished. We managed to find records showing that the nuns sold the machinery for scrap. So there was still sort of profit making even when the building was being repurposed. So the deeds of the property state that it can only be used for educational purposes, which is one positive thing I think that happened when the religious orders decided to sell the campus, is that it can't be used for apartments or turned into a hotel or something that we're seeing in many other sites. So we're losing the validity of the sites. And yes, we have promises, of course, at the moment for Sean McDermott Street in Dublin to become a site of conscience. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't protect and demand in localized areas that we protect the buildings, the memories, and use them as really, permanent reminders of this history. So you can see, just to scale out a small bit of the location in Waterford and where it sits. This is the main road that goes into Waterford City. Walking distance, it's maybe 10 minutes into the centre of town. It's a very imposing structure. There's many stories from local residents that the first time they could see over the wall, which has been lowered substantially since WIT took over the campus, but the wall was much higher, meaning that if you walked around the wall, you couldn't see in. You could hear children's voices and so on. My father remembers the smell of the carbolic soap because he walked past the campus to his school that was about 2 minutes away. So there's all of these sort of anecdotal stories about the building. I myself was threatened with it as a child when I misbehaved. You're going into the Good Shepherds if you don't stop. And even though I didn't know what that meant, I knew it wasn't good. And when I got older and there was sort of, more recognition of what took place in the building, and people were very defensive. I didn't know, and I said, but how did you know to threaten children with it? Like everyone of my generation has that experience. So there was a very clear demonstration to me that the public in Waterford really wanted to respond in some way, but didn't know how. They really wanted to perform allyship, but didn't know how. But there was a defensiveness there as well, that they hadn't acted or maybe hadn't spoken up at the time when they were children. And of course, they were part of the same oppressive systemic system that allowed these institutions to function. And this is not about retribution. It's about how do we honor this history? How do we allow young people to access this history in order to look forward, in order to identify human rights violations and abuses that occur today? If we hide the ones that are in our recent past and really existing in our current lives, we're doing a serious disservice to what we're trying to accomplish in these pieces of work that we've heard about this morning. So part of the work that I've been doing over the past couple of years was really focusing on the concept of education and how do we translate these really complicated, dense, multidisciplinary analysis that are taking place by survivors, by academics, by activists, and create materials that are going to be useful and that can be used by teachers in a very practical way. We don't want to perpetuate avoidance because it's too much, it's too scary, it's too intense, and how do we do this in a way that's meaningful? So myself and a colleague, Dr. Kate McCarthy, who's a lecturer in performance, when we saw the launch of the Creative Ireland programme, which has both a local as well as a national impact, we really saw the kind of, an opportunity to create a module essentially around the materials that we had already compiled. So we wanted to create this lens through heritage and culture. When I started this work, I went to the heritage officers and, made my argument that I see this as our heritage. We should embody it in the same way that in Waterford we have the Viking Triangle and Reginald's Tower. I don't see that this narrative is any different in terms of recognizing our heritage. It is part of it, whether we want to embrace it or not. So when I originally sort of presented this to anybody sort of involved in heritage, and I was knocking on every door and asking every question I could think of, I was looked at like I had 10 heads. I mean, the idea that this would be our heritage seemed to be a completely, out there proposal. And I'm glad to see things have changed substantially since then. So it was really important. With some funders, it's not necessarily the fund, but it's the recognition from the funder that this project belongs in that lens and it belongs as part of heritage, which was really important as well. So what we did to start off with is we had a one-day symposium where we invited collaborators, stakeholders, to debate about all of these topics, to take a look at the materials that existed and decide what should go into this project and who should we be aiming for, who are our audience with these materials. So our other point, of course, with this being free, publicly available, no cost, et cetera, et cetera. So the collaborators that we ended up with at the seminar, we had some academic experts that have worked in a variety of different lenses or disciplines. We had student body representatives, a deputy principal and secondary school teacher. We had member of Justice for Magdalene's, Claire McGettrick, that's in the picture there. We had survivors, a librarian, vice chair of Historical Society, and local artist and live art facilitator who works heavily with adolescent groups. So we tried to sort of combat as many lenses as you can see as possible. Of course, this is ongoing work, and I think everyone that is creating these materials would agree that we have to constantly re-edit, we have to constantly update, that these are never finished products, they're always live pieces. So all of these discussions were incredibly helpful. By and large, we were all on the same page, which makes life significantly easier and is a rarity. So that was nice that there was kind of coherent agreement with what we were debating. So the source content ended up with three sort of categories around primary sources, such as the oral histories within interviews across numerous projects. So there's the CHUM Oral History Programme, we collated oral histories, Justice for Magdalene's have also. There's a lot of information out there that's a little bit disparate at the moment, and you have to kind of, and unless you know it's there, you have to really go seeking it. And we were trying to pull a lot of these resources together as well. Secondary sources then, certain types of historical records, whether it can be primary or secondary, of course, archives, media coverage, and so on. And then academic analysis, such as peer-reviewed articles, publications, and so on. And the final part was my sort of baby. Being a psychology lecturer, I knew very clearly that fear was going to be a major issue for teachers, that this is ethically challenging work. There's always a fear that if you introduce a topic, you're going to get asked questions or you'll have potential responses from students. And how comfortable you are with dealing with those responses is going to hinder or encourage your use of the materials. So what we created at the end of the resource are a set of appendices to sort of our barometer checks to see how students are coping as the materials are being used. So these are very, very small kind of snapshots as the materials are being delivered. They could be used at the beginning of a session, at the end of a session. They can be used halfway through. They're very malleable in that sense. So the idea would be that, fearing, I suppose, an emotive response isn't to be unexpected. But I think our fear around emotion is a bigger substantive issue, is that emotion isn't a bad thing. We should be seeing emotion in response to these materials, to listening to these oral histories. If we don't, we have a significantly bigger problem. So it's really about, we wanted to support teachers and to give them some additional tools to be able to deal with these materials as well. So we wanted to integrate active, creative learning processes. There's options for, activities, discussion questions, self-reflection. We've packed in a lot so that teachers can pick and choose the elements that work for them in their classroom, and if students are sort of progressed enough that they can do independent work in the area as well. So the promotion of critical thinking is a big factor. Nothing in the document that we created gives an answer. It presents the materials and says, there you go, look at them and be critical about what's missing. We've heard this morning quite a bit about sort of presencing the absence. And a big part of that is allowing students to identify those gaps in an age-appropriate way for themselves. That instead of telling them the problems, that they're able to identify it through the materials. And of course, this is an ongoing narrative. It's an ongoing social debate. It's both history as well as present. And so for that reason, ongoing critical thinking as an output is a very desirable kind of response at the end of it. So the potential to build empathy and tolerance with any of the educational materials being discussed this morning is certainly there. Now, as just a note, I suppose, on empathy is a double-edged sword. And I'm hearing a huge amount about, if you increase empathy, you reduce, aggression, you reduce all of these other, things in society we want to reduce, misogyny, racism, and so on. The reality is that empathy actually encourages us to be kind and tolerant and sympathetic towards people that are like us or that we like. That's what empathy does. So I use empathy in the colloquial sense because I think it works to access what we're getting at, but really compassion is what we're looking for. So compassion is more regulated. It doesn't mean that you have to walk in the person's shoes, because for some people that's all-encompassing and it's debilitating. It's too much to do that all day, every day in the work. And counselors and professionals are very good at compassion, at ensuring that they are listening and that they are interested and so on, but not to the point that they are burnt out so they can no longer do the work that they're trying to do. So empathy, we have to be really careful that if we keep emphasizing the concept of walking in somebody else's shoes, we find that cognitively really difficult to do if someone's shoes don't look like my shoes. It's harder to do that. But compassion is much more likely, much more beneficial, and much more healthy. So just a little side note on that idea. So all of the materials that we're using are present on the website, and I'm just going to quickly show you that here. Let's see. Okay, so this is the homepage of the website, and it just sort of sets up kind of who we are and what we do, and that the purpose really of the Waterford Memories Project is always around education, because as lecturers, that's what we do. We're involved in education. I'm not sure what's happening here. We'll just click on there and hope for the best. Okay, so I don't know why we're not loading. Sorry guys, I'll just give this a minute. This should look nice with pictures here, but for some reason we're not getting it. Let me just reload. Okay. there we are. It's slowly coming back to life. Okay, so the educational materials pack that I'm talking about today is sort of one part of a suite of other projects that we've been involved in. And the premise with anything we do is full transparency around who's involved, where did funding come from, how was it used, and really the point being is that our work as academics is publicly funded, it's public money. We are therefore responsible to the public in what we do. So that transparency, both from the point of view of the general public as well as survivors, I think is really important to sort of break down the barriers that do exist between the people that have lived experience that can sometimes happen. Sorry guys, I don't know what is happening here. Let me just try and get this another load here. Delayed. Is it in this room? It's just a bit disastrous. Okay, I appreciate the NUIG people who know the room. So if it doesn't work, I can manage to talk through some of the points as we go along. So this is the page for the PDF document, and it's downloadable. So we have a lot packed in. At the moment, we have, 62 pages, and I think it's going to end up looking similar to like the volume of 8,000 pages if we keep going on here. So we are constantly sort of updating things like the reading lists and recommended reading and so on. And it was the decision between it being overwhelming and useful, right? Because the reality is any of the teachers here today that would consider using these resources, you're not going to get 12 weeks to do this. It's really unlikely. As part of our stakeholder meeting, the response that we had from teachers about how to target this was that transition year was the most likely time period that teachers could choose to deliver these materials as an individual sort of set of projects or over the longer term. So we kept that in mind where a teacher could sort of dip in and just use one of the exercises, or they could choose to use sort of a full program, and that all of those approaches are absolutely fine. And we try to be, again, as interdisciplinary as possible. So whether you're teaching CSPE or history or English or performance or whatever it might be, that there's a material that is useful in some way, shape, or form. So just to give you an idea of the document, we broke it into 4 sections. So we have setting the space, which is really just guidance for teachers to come up with negotiating sort of ground rules in the classroom that can open the discussion around these kind of difficult and contested areas. And again, we're very careful to say in the description that this is just the starting point. It's not the end. It's not written like a history book where this happened on such and such a date, this was the outcome, off we go. That this is really just a starting point. So apologies now if you're getting nauseous here as I'm flying through. I just wanted to, I dare not come back out of the link while it's working. So you can see here we've given sort of, descriptions, and then we have independent study tasks where we're trying to use multimedia sources such as documentaries, as well as chapters, papers, and so on. And then that first part of sort of setting the scene is that background context of institutional abuse, the Magdalen Laundries, industrial schools, and so on, discussion tasks, and so forth. So then we looked at this idea of tying the materials into the themes of CSPE and the work that happens in transition year and just before it. And we really wanted to sort of make those links easier. So for teachers, when you're looking at, okay, but what am I teaching? Am I teaching the history of institutional abuse in Ireland, or am I teaching about citizenship? And I'm using this as a case study to understand citizenship. So we try to kind of blend both of those goals here. So things about having the students sort of self-reflect or engage in sort of proactive activities. And we have examples in the appendices of the student being centered here and their terms and identities and how they see their relationship with the environment that they're present in, so that they can reflect on the environment that would have been present in the descriptions of survivor testimony. So even before, a student might hear survivor testimony, we have examples here again of poetry, song, creative responses to the Magdalene Laundries that can be used then to reflect. Now, for instance, we've given as a song Joni Mitchell's Magdalene Laundries, which is not accurate, so in places. So it's wonderful that there is a recognition on an international stage, and that's part again of where if the students hear from survivors versus some responses that of course are meant well, but may kind of perpetuate a lack of factual knowledge around the experiences of survivors. So you get a sense, I'm not going to go through 60 pages of this, but you get a sense maybe of what we were trying to do. And importantly, I think, is the appendices work, the barometer checking with students, because sometimes I think we underestimate their capability and overestimate how traumatized they're going to be. Students don't exist in a bubble. Teenagers don't exist in a universe that's perfect and unchallenging and non-contested. So I find usually that they will say the work is challenging, but they really enjoyed it. And it's given them a completely different appreciation, I think, as well, for the history of Irish women, because let's admit it, there is a complete vacuum in history for the role of women, and seeing that dealt with in some way has had good responses. So to kind of put this back into the bigger context, I'm so grateful to this publication. Many people in the room were involved in the listening exercises and facilitating those workshops. And we've all known for a really long time that survivors, family members, and so on have been saying this needs to be part of an education. This must form part of a curriculum. We shouldn't have students graduating at Leaving Cert level who don't even know really of the existence of these institutions that they're walking past on a daily basis. So this is absolutely work towards transitional justice efforts, and it's a way that students can see that they're contributing to transitional justice in a meaningful way, and for teachers to be involved in this process. Transitional justice is a large-scale response. It's not a handful of individuals, and I do get the sense that there's a real desire to participate towards what survivors this morning have said they need. We know it's not up to us as academics to decide what's needed. The survivors are telling us very clearly and very loudly exactly what they want, and we just need to quite literally listen to that. So the quote at the bottom is from that listening exercise, and again, it really summarizes the need and the desire coming from survivor groups for this idea. And I would argue that those opportunities for allyship and activism are plenty, and there's a real role for education in this process, and to keep kind of knocking on the doors, looking for that systemic change, where at some point we would hope that this knowledge becomes part of a mandatory curriculum versus us, really wanting buy-in from teachers and really wanting to support teachers to deliver these materials. So on the idea of sort of memory, it came up before about the prevailing narrative, I think, that we have around institutions. And it always amazes me when I hear somebody say, oh yeah, but the Magdalene Laundries were where pregnant women were sent. And we still have really problematic narratives that are seen as robust, despite the amount of media coverage, despite the amount of conversation that's been happening at government level. It's not reaching where we needed to go. And living, eating, and breathing the research, you assume that sort of, everyone has sort of picked up on this idea or challenged narratives. And of course, that's not the case. Again, why these educational materials are so important. But memory is a political tool. It has been used and manipulated by the Irish state and by the religious orders for a very long time. And all of this work is about challenging that through many different ways and lenses, but it's all really got a cumulative goal of saying, this is not the memory, this is not the cohesive narrative at all. And it's always one of the fear points for me is that when we do this work, and Kate and I would have had lots of conversations about this, is our fear of then becoming the new narrators because that's not what we should be doing. We're not the narrators of this story at all. We're there to platform the true narrators and the true experiences, and making sure that we become invisible. We shouldn't be at the fore of any of this work. So that's that balance I often just on a personal level struggle with. I think because I'm so critical of memory and memory shaping, the self-reflection of being aware that I'm complicit in that process is absolutely present. So collective memory has become not what actually happened, but the story of what happened. And that is changeable, right? That we have an ability to sort of counter that and to argue it, and again, constant revision of these educational materials, I think, is part of that as well. So the other side, if we teach students via these resources, where in the oral history survivors are very adept at calling out the human rights violations, they're very adept at understanding how they were marginalized and communicating that. If students better understand the manipulation of memories, it's more difficult to continue to abuse memories. It's more difficult for a government to be able to sell us a certain narrative that we're readily going to accept. So those themes fitting into ideas of equality, human rights, what are our common values? If we say we care about human rights, then we need to actually demonstrate it. We need to actually model that behavior for students going forward. So that prevailing narrative, I think, is definitely an issue, and one that we can tackle via these methods. So the next steps for us, because we had the unfortunate launch of the resource scheduled the day after all the institutions closed because of COVID. So needless to say, the launch went a bit awry. So since COVID, now that things have settled, we've been contacting schools, and as many of you will know as teachers, it's very, very difficult to carve out chunks of time to bring in new materials, and that has to be done well in advance. You sort of need to know a year before you need to do it. So these are the conversations we're having at the moment, is to formalize the use of the materials to get proper feedback. We've had a lot of anecdotal feedback. We know it's being used in certain ways, but we want to formalize that a bit more to help us plan moving forward. So I'm very grateful that the students that are presenting after me actually have that formalized feedback, so it's a nice transition into that idea. And just to comment on this image here, this is an art installation by a former student, Marie Lee, called Silent Footsteps. When I mentioned at the beginning slide that the Magdalene girls would enter the church via a side entrance hallway to ensure that they weren't seen by the industrial school girls lest they contaminate them. Marie Lee created this display of footprints along the pathway during an installation where we invited members of the public to come into the buildings, walk around, see everything. So even though everybody in Waterford knows the buildings, very few people have actually been in them. And really, it's about sort of breaking down those literal and metaphorical walls. So the final points just to make here, I think for my interest, or why I'm really happy that this event today was happening, is there's so much amazing work going on, Ireland and internationally. But we tend to be quite siloed. We're all kind of doing it in our own institutions or in our own way. I would love to see a centralized location, and maybe that's something, I'll pitch this out to everybody now, a much more centralized location where all of these materials are easily accessible, locatable, and easier to be used and put into practice. The government has siloed the institutions for a reason, and it's so that we don't identify the systemic abuses and we don't identify the absolute pervasiveness of what took place in Irish history. And I would hate that we would perpetuate that in our response to the siloing. It's easier to think it's a one-off if you think it just happened once or again or whatever, instead of an orchestrated, pervasive system that was put into place. And to end, unfortunately, on a slightly negative note, there is a practical element to this work. We depend heavily on volunteers, as the students will be able to attest. And the irony of talking about devalued labour when the volunteers are also falling within that umbrella is something, again, that never sits right with me. The reality is we can't do the work without people giving us their goodwill, their time, their energy, their effort. But that's not the right way to do things either. And relying on unseen labor or undervalued labor is a big problem. And it's an unfortunate kind of, again, systemic problem. But at least, the starting point is to call it out, maybe make it visible and so on. We try to do our best to be very careful around, acknowledging the input that people have into projects and so on. But it is the reality of the way things are. The other point is continuous funding around just, paying for a website. Funders won't fund things like this. So, it is a constant battle to keep the show on the road a lot of times, particularly when sometimes people don't want you to do this work and aren't particularly supportive of it. It can be a little bit more challenging in that way. So thank you, and apologies for the multitude of different angles and everything that I've covered there, but thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so hi everyone. Can you hear me properly? Yeah. No? Can you hear me now? Yes. Great, okay. So I'm Helen and I graduated with an LLM in International Human Rights Law in 2020 from the Irish Centre of Human Rights. And I'm just going to talk to you today very briefly about how the idea of a lesson plan came into fruition. So myself, Tomas, and 3 others were members of a human rights clinic that was spearheaded by our community organisers, Fiona Fox and Mary Harney. And very early into our discussions about what our project might be, we realised that there needed to be a heavy emphasis on the need for memorialisation, especially for those who faced human rights violations in Ireland's various institutions. And we understood from the beginning that whatever this memorialisation might be, it needs to be in a form that would amplify the voices of survivors, but also it had to be something that we could teach the younger generations and in a larger sense to prevent repetition. So as soon as we began our research, we realised it was abundantly clear that this part of Irish history had been completely left out of the national curriculum at secondary level. And so we took this as an opportunity to address this lack of awareness and this memorialisation through education. And so the idea of our lesson plan was born, one that could be taught by teachers across the country, and one that would cover the various institutions in Ireland, but also the obligations of the state, back then and nowadays, and also the important role of human rights law. So in close collaboration with Fiona and Mary, we carried out months of research into Ireland's institutions, and we also looked at how other countries such as Canada and Germany taught parts of their dark history. And so we spoke to students and teachers and activists and lawyers and anyone we could in order to formulate a lesson plan that was not only comprehensive and historically accurate, but sensitive as well. So our original lesson plan, it was designed to take place over 2 hours, and we were targeting transition year students. So we created this general lesson plan, which covered all of Ireland's institutions as a whole, but we also created a lesson plan specific to Galway, as we were hoping to visit a school in Galway, and we thought it might resonate with students more if it was tailored to their locality. So I'm going to hand you over to Tomas now, who's going to go through the lesson plans.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. It's such an honour. So what I'm going to go through would be the lesson plan here with you. So our lesson plan consisted of 5 main learning objectives. So we've begun by highlighting the human rights violations in regard to the right to identity. We then looked at the institutions themselves. So we looked at the mother and baby institutions, the industrial schools, the Magdalene laundries, and then we looked into issues surrounding adoptions and foreign adoption and legal adoptions. So throughout, I suppose, the lesson plan, these we used group activity, poetry, music, art. We gave information, obviously, about each individual topic. We went into the human rights abuses. We looked at the violations. We looked at identity, we looked at identity as a whole, and with collaborative work, we were able to engage with the students, ask them what they needed or what they thought of it, and we would go through it. So we created this lesson plan, as my colleague said, as a general lesson plan looking at all of Ireland, but we actually localised it, and we wanted to include a section on the local institutions around Galway City. So myself and my colleague, we actually walked around Galway City and we photographed all of the various institutions. So we wanted to, highlight these to the students to say, you are walking past these institutions every day, and you don't know what you're walking past. You would just walk by it. This would be, for an example, this is a photo from down at the coach station, which is actually right across from the laundry itself in Galway City. So we wanted to localize it, but we also wanted to show that this model could be adapted to whoever carries it out in the future. So if you're doing it like you're doing in Waterford, you adapt it to the Waterford institution. So our lesson plan was designed in a general way that could be adopted to the areas, so you could focus specifically on the institutions in that area. So we went into each of those, we went into each of the sections. We had a 2-hour period, we had 2 classes that we would be able to cover everything. Unfortunately, we were the class of 2020, the class of COVID. So our brilliant idea, as we like to think, had to be then modelled to be able to be done online. So we had to not scrap everything, but we had to just adapt to just any way that we could carry out the class, because we didn't know how long the pandemic would obviously go on for, so we had to be prepared in a sense. And it's actually it's crazy to think of today that today would be the first day that we met in person, our coordinator Fiona Fox, to meet you in person for the first time after spending hours on Zoom, which is hilarious. But we tailored everything to be done online. And then, of course, as we completed the works, we actually came out of, so we actually had the opportunity then to go into the schools. So I'll touch on that later on. But our plan was to, So when we went through each of so we went through all of the institutions, we went through the human rights violations. We then wanted to conclude with what could be done moving forward. So the right to redress, the right to access justice, the right preventing repetition. We wanted to see what. So I'll go through this. This was, sorry, just a side note. This was a striking image that. This is an image of Crow Park full. It can only hold 82,300 people. This is a fraction of the amount of people that were actually affected by these institutions. So if you wanted to think of all of the people in Ireland that were affected by these institutions, there's no place in Ireland that could hold all of these people together. So this is just one slide that I wanted to highlight. So When we went through what could be done moving forward, going through the right to redress, right to access justice, preventing repetition, we followed the lesson plan by a testimony from a survivor of a resistor of these institutions. So we introduced our esteemed colleague Mary Harney at the beginning of the presentation, and we didn't actually introduce them as a survivor. We just introduced them as a person that's been and a PhD candidate who is working on this project. You say when we brought Mary up after the lesson plan, we said this is actually a person who has been affected by these institutions, and they are going to give their story. So that we then followed that up with a Q&A session with the students. So we also then had created evaluations for the students to give us feedback on what we could improve on, what we could add to it, what they think was effective. So actually, I don't know, is it in these slides? So we did manage then to go out to Colosh na Curba out in Knocknacarra. We carried out this pilot program back in 2021. Yeah. Yes. We got great feedback from it. So it was a transition year class that we got to meet. We had the afternoon to go through everything with us. With them. So these slides, supposed to be designed these specific ones to fit that class of the 2-hour period. Last week or the week before. So we're still actually carrying out this work. So 2 weeks ago, myself and Helen went to Salerno School to meet 3 different groups of transition year students. So we met nearly 100 students that day. We did, it was about an hour-long class that we did. So we had to condense everything down to fit the time frame. But we were able to carry out 3 different sessions that day. We are still continuing on with this work. We have graduated nearly 2 years. Like this, we started this 2 years ago. We have graduated. We're still continuing on with this work. This has been, I suppose, a passion project of ours for the last few years. We've seen how crucial it is. Nearly every speaker before us mentioned the need for this type of program. And it is such an honor for us to be here today to show, okay, this is the work that we have been doing over the past few years, to show actually you are saying that there is a need for it. Well, we have been doing it. So the resources are available now, all on the Open Heart City website. So I'm going to switch over to it here. So this is us in our masks, socially distant. It's actually Mary's birthday. You can see a cake there. This was us. So we, in collaboration with the Law Clinic, so we were able to upload all of our research and our resources onto the Open Heart City website. So this is just a brief synopsis of what we did. We then, let's see if I can get it up and running. So this is actually us at Colosh na Curba. We made all of our resources available on this. So we designed a guidebook for teachers to continue on teaching this, adopt it to however they see fit. We give the PowerPoints, we give scripts, we give the general lesson plans, we give brochures. We also then linked our online database, so that's just actually us as well then in the school. We also then created an educational archive. This was my own little passion project as part of it as well, where I linked in different websites that we thought could be resourceful to these students and to the teachers. I found articles across every sort of media coverage that I could find that I thought was relevant. I linked it here for them to go through. For you all to go through as well if you want. So that's part of the it's available under the Open Heart City the Sean McDermott Street, the website under resources. So we're there under the postgraduate project there. All this information is available on that website for anyone that wants to continue doing this work. We are continuing to go to secondary schools. We're still doing this. We're still going out. We've learned so much today that we want to add into it. I'd say we need nearly a week with the students at this stage with the amount of information we give them. There's so much that we want to continue adding to it, continue developing. It is it's been an honour to be part of this today, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I know I'm the last speaker before lunch, but please bear with me. So my name is Holly. I've just graduated from the Masters here in NUI Galway, or University of Galway, I should say now. And we started our clinic project, myself, James, Shauna Maria, and two of our other colleagues who couldn't be here today, last October. Last October, we met our community organiser, or as she would describe herself, our beefer, doer, gopher, Mary Harney. And what Mary said to us in that first meeting was very brief, very open-ended. Mary said, legacy. It's a legacy project. And that spooked me completely. I was terrified. How could we continue the legacy of last year? How could we do justice to the legacy of the people who have lived experience in these institutions? What could we possibly do? It seemed like such a daunting task. We knew the end goal was ultimately, and it still is the end goal, to have it on the curriculum, the national curriculum for the Leaving Cert. We know this is a long time away. We're still working towards it, and hopefully we'll get there one day. So we followed this theme of legacy, and we began pitching ideas last year, and quickly we settled on the idea of a podcast. We're all young people. That's how we get our information. We thought that would be good to get other slightly younger people, get through to them. So it didn't seem at first like an obvious successor to this wonderful lesson plan that we've all seen here today, but we thought it would fit in quite well, and we felt confident it would diversify the educational resources. So we agreed that it was especially important in this post-COVID world we find ourselves in that we need to have things online, resources online that people can access and find easily, so even if we can't physically be with students, they could access these materials themselves and engage in self-directed learning. So we set to work developing the podcast. It quickly became clear that there was a huge amount of work to do, deciding upon content, structure. What we would say was going to be hugely difficult, especially then we'd consider as lawyers, we love the sound of our own voices, we love speaking, we needed to listen, and that was quite hard for me personally. So what we found ourselves doing was actually reaching back to the previous years and their lesson plan. It provided a huge help to us. We were able to structure our podcast around it hugely. So when we were scripting the podcast, we kept looking back. How did the guys do the lesson plan? How did that go for them? What can we say in the podcast? So the podcast took centre stage for us, and Mary reminded us that the lesson plan itself was still in its infancy. It still could go. We could go into schools. We needed to, bring up the numbers, bring up the sample size of students that had received the lesson plan or had engaged with it, and whether this was positive, whether we were just, throwing stuff at the wall and it wasn't going to stick. Was it going to work at all? And we had to find that out. So we were eager to do this, but we were very tight on time in terms of the academic year. But we did find ourselves engaging in this more recently, even though the academic year for us is long finished. So shortly after the new year, another idea came to the fore, a conference to engage teachers and possibly students themselves as to how crucial this element of Irish history and society is to everyone. It seemed like a very tall tale, I'm not going to lie. I didn't see it coming to fruition myself, but here we are. So against the backdrop of our master's dissertation, which we just completed about 6 weeks ago, we found ourselves emerging from the fog, from the haze, and we got together. The conference was fast approaching, thanks in no small part to the efforts of Shauna. This has been her baby from the very start. And we found that the podcast, even though we'd promoted it, we were quite content with the content of it. It was good, we felt happy with it, everyone had given us the thumbs up. Personally, I found it difficult to see how it could fit in with everything else. Had we continued the legacy project, were we doing enough? So earlier this week, I found myself back in my old secondary school, facing 30 16-year-olds on a Monday morning. It was not pleasant. They were struggling with morning grogginess, so was I. I was haunted by the memories of being in the same classroom myself as a 16-year-old, sitting through the most boring talks from people I didn't care about. And I was terrified we were going to repeat the same thing. I spent ages working with the PowerPoint the guys did for Galway. I tailored it to Cork. I am from Cork, I will bring that up maybe again. So I tailored the lesson plan to show these young people. We also only had 50 minutes, so it was quite a stretch. I felt a lot of pressure to get them on board. I completely discredited them. I said, oh, there's no way they're going to care. They're not even going to listen. It's going to be horrific. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was absolutely fantastic. It's been one of the most rewarding experiences I've had as part of anything to do with the clinic so far. These young people who at the start probably didn't care, by the end of this hour period, they were so on board. They asked questions, the students that were whispering to themselves. They actually asked very emotionally intelligent and insightful questions at the end. A girl came up to Mary at the very end and asked, can I study this in college? I want to know so much more. What can you tell me? It was brilliant. And then we turned to the evaluation forms. So between my old school in Cork, Salerno and Kinvara just this week, there's about 200 evaluation forms. And across that were handed to each student filled out one evaluation form. There has not been a single no in terms of the question, should this be on the curriculum? Do you want to see this in your school? It's been absolutely yeses across the board. And I haven't had the time to collate all the data from the individual feedback section that the students could write in themselves, but it's quite clear that these young people, they do care. They know this is part of Irish history now, and they know they need to know more about it. They're angry at the government because they haven't heard more about it, and they're indignant that people think they're not, emotionally intelligent enough to hear about it. So we were also able to use the podcast, which had seemed a bit floating off into the distance at one point, didn't seem to fit in with the legacy. We were able to say to the students on Monday, here's a podcast, you can go listen to it. Their eyes lit up. We all love podcasts. So the podcast numbers, there's been 275 plays across all 7 episodes. So 70% of the listeners are based in Ireland. And whilst we're delighted with the global reach, with people listening as far away as Indonesia, Mexico, United States, Brazil, and Australia, the demographic is still slightly skewed towards slightly older people and more female. So we're hoping that in time, as we continue piloting the lesson plan, that we can use the podcast as one of the tools and maybe even have teachers playing it for their students in class. So we find ourselves at the conference that was an extraordinary tall tale back in February. In my view, it has completely cemented the direction and momentum of this legacy project. So the session we have after lunch is, how do we create an inclusive history of Ireland's institutions? The how is very much still elusive. It remains up in the air. For me, the why do young people care? Why are we still coming back after all these times? These why questions have been put to bed, they've been answered. There's such an appetite for this, and we just have the long road ahead of figuring out how to get it on the curriculum. So thank you very much.